When we think about how we know what we know, we tend to overestimate our ability to find new information, to test hypotheses the way we've probably learned that science is supposed to do. Science is supposed to take a hypothesis, test it, and then maybe retest it, submit it to peer review for others to retest before it graduates to become a theory. And we might think, well, that's the way I come to my conclusions about the world. Well, to test this, the psychologist Peter Wason came up with an experiment. He would ask his class to look at these three numbers and try to come up with a hypothesis about what rule led him to pick those three numbers in that order. And they had to then test their hypothesis, but they couldn't just ask him, is this the rule? They had to come up with three numbers of their own, and they would ask him, do these three numbers fit the rule or not, and use that as a way to figure out as specifically as they could what the rule was. So if you see the three numbers, 2, 4, and 6, you might think, oh, I see even numbers increasing by 2 each time. So I'm going to test that hypothesis by asking if the numbers 8, 10, 12 fit the rule, or the numbers 14, 16, 18 fit the rule, or 92, 94, 96. And in all these cases, Wason would say, yes, those numbers fit the rule. And he would then ask his students, do you now know what the rule is? And they would say, yes, of course, it's just even numbers increasing by 2 each time. And he would say, no, that's not the rule. The only way they would get that right is, even though they thought that the rule probably was even numbers increasing by 2, if they tested it by suggesting a sequence of numbers that they thought would not fit the rule. So risk having Dr. Wason tell them, no, your number suggestion is wrong. It doesn't fit the rule. But they had to risk that to find out what the rule was. So if they would test the numbers 1, 2, and 3, they might not expect that those numbers would fit the rule, but they try it anyway. Or 6, 4, 2, so the same three numbers, but in a different order. Or 1, 17, 133, so not increasing by 1 or 2, but by irregular intervals each time. And they would probably be surprised that 1, 2, and 3 did fit the rule. They would probably may or may not be surprised that 6, 4, 2 did not fit the rule, and probably be surprised that 1, 17, 133, a sequence that has no regular interval between them, that did fit the rule. But it's only by trying to get it wrong that they were able to figure out precisely what the rule was. And the rule was just numbers increasing. It didn't have to be any particular interval. But they wouldn't know that if they had already sort of gotten stuck on the hypothesis that it was even numbers, or that it was by that it was increasing by 2 each time. But when they would suggest numbers that fit the hypothesis they already had, this is sometimes called a positive test strategy. More often it's called confirmation bias. In other words, I'm looking for information that will confirm the general principle, the hypothesis that I have in my head, rather than asking myself, how could I disprove that hypothesis? Or if that hypothesis was wrong, what information, what facts would prove that hypothesis wrong? That second thing is called falsification. Falsification doesn't just mean you disprove something. It means you at least try to disprove something. I'm looking, even if I have this hypothesis in my head that the 2, 4, 6 numbers were chosen because the rule is even numbers increasing by 2, I'm never gonna know if that's right if I keep suggesting more even numbers increasing by 2 each time. I'm gonna continue to get confirmation, but I'm never gonna know for sure unless I try to get it wrong by looking at information that I don't expect to fit the rule, and I'm surprised when it does fit the rule, or I might be surprised if it doesn't fit the rule. But trying to surprise myself through falsification, I'm taking a risk. I'm risking this feeling of knowing, this feeling of closure, this feeling that I have the answer. And that's a good feeling, but as long as I have that feeling, I'm not going to be looking for another answer that might be more accurate. Well, this phenomenon is something that the author Julia Galef describes in her book, The Scout Mindset. And I'm having the class read the first chapter of that, where she describes what she means by the Scout Mindset. And she gives an example from a very famous historical event, sometimes known as the Dreyfus Affair, where in the later part of the 19th century in France, France is not, at the time at war with Germany, but they know that Germany is their big military rival, and have fought wars in the past. And, we, of course, know that World War I is not that far away, but they do know that they have to be very careful about, their military strength versus the military strength of Germany. And in the German embassy in Paris, a cleaning lady who was actually a spy for the French government, but she's pretending to be a cleaning lady in the German embassy. She finds in a garbage can a letter that contains military information about France, but it's obviously in possession of the Germans. So the French military clearly have to find the perpetrator. They have to find the spy that has been delivering this letter to their military rivals, the Germans. And Dreyfus was chosen more than likely because he was part of a small group of people who had access to information at the clearance level that was in that note. But there were a lot of other people that had access to that information. He was the only Jewish member of the Army's general staff, and the stereotype at the time, and unfortunately, stereotype that has not receded much over the past century, was that because he's Jewish, he's less loyal to France, or because he's not Christian, he doesn't have the exact same moral values as Christian citizens of France, or something to that effect. But they didn't just try to convict him just on that. The French prosecutors put together a list of what they thought of as evidence. And I'm using Galef's description from her book, The Scout Mindset, here. But their list of evidence contained things like he was one of a small number of officers with high enough rank to have access to sensitive information mentioned in the memo. Okay, that makes sense. He was not well liked. His fellow officers considered him cold, arrogant, and boastful. Okay, well, that's a personality thing. Does that necessarily mean he's a spy? One man reported seeing Dreyfus loitering somewhere, asking probing questions. Well, that might be something a spy would do. It might also be something that a member of the chiefs generals or the general staff would do, just to be sure that people weren't saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, that people were following protocol. His military intelligence requires not only understanding things about the enemy, but understanding how your own forces put together. Another reported to have heard Dreyfus praising the German Empire. Well, here again, why would somebody who worked for one military, who was a high-ranking officer in one military, why would he say positive things about the other? Well, maybe it's because, he idolizes that other military, but maybe it's because he doesn't want his own military to underestimate the threat from their rival. And at the time, even though we know France is going to lose to Germany twice in the two world wars, at the time, France actually had the bigger and the better funded military. And, by warning people that maybe the German military is more powerful than they realized, he was actually trying to prepare his military rather than, express his contempt for his own military. He was spotted at least one gambling establishment. Rumor had it that he had mistresses. As you can see, all of these, or the majority of these elements that are cited as evidence have multiple interpretations. One interpretation could fit with this idea of a spy, but each of them have an alternative explanation that is much less nefarious. Now, they had a handwriting analyst look at his handwriting and then look at the letter that had been found in the German embassy. And one handwriting analyst said that it was a match, but a second handwriting analyst said that it was not a match. I'm going to come back to that later. But Dreyfus was convicted. He was sent to solitary confinement in the Devil's Island Penitentiary on the other side of the world, literally the other side of the world, from France to an island off the coast of South America. And while he was there, the French government, the French military intelligence, weren't quite satisfied that there might not be an appeal. So they assigned an officer, or a Lieutenant Colonel George Picquart, to keep looking for evidence. Just in case they had to, come up against an appeal that they would want even more evidence than what they had before. And so all of those sorts of, tidbits and anecdotes were compiled in a big file that was supposedly, damning evidence against Dreyfus, and that was passed on to Picquart. Now, you can imagine the position Picquart is in. He is assigned to gather more evidence for this case that's already been settled, but might be reopened later. But he's got a couple of options. One option is just do what he's been ordered to do, which is go find more things that could fit in this file. Not necessarily any particular piece of evidence, although I'm sure they would love it if there was some absolute evidence, some smoking gun type evidence, but just more data that might go into this file to make Dreyfus seem more guilty. But alternatively, he could look through that evidence and decide, wait, is this really evidence? In other words, he could choose the same choice we had with Wason's experiment. We can choose to use confirmation bias. That is, go out and look for information that confirms what we've already decided, which is that Dreyfus is guilty. Or he can look at that, he can look for evidence against that decision to find out if Dreyfus really was guilty. Now, you can see this from a couple of perspectives. If his goal is to just justify this foregone conclusion, this past judgment, then the actions are going to be different than if his goal is to actually, make sure he's found the right spy. If he's just trying to use confirmation bias to prove Dreyfus guilty, he's going to just focus on Dreyfus, find more facts that corroborate that conviction, and the consequences for him personally are going to be probably pretty good. He'll probably get promoted for that. But the consequence for France nationally is probably going to be bad if Dreyfus isn't actually the spy. So, remember, even if you're assigned to, continue to convict this one person, if there actually is another spy, then that means someone is actually still passing information along to the Germans. So if his goal is to find that actual spy, then he's going to behave very differently. He's going to question the relevance of the file full of anecdotes that are called evidence. He's going to look for other evidence that might go against other suspects or reveal other suspects. And the consequences for him might be bad. He might not get promoted. He's not going to make a lot of friends out of the superior officers who have assigned him to do this. And as we're going to see, that is very much the case. People are very angry at him for doing this. But ultimately, if he succeeds in finding the real spy, if it's not Dreyfus, then the consequences for France are very good. And ultimately, the actual author of that spy letter was found, and it wasn't Dreyfus. It was a guy named Major Ferdinand Wason Esterhazy. And ultimately, because Picard chose to go the route of falsification, ultimately he was proven right. But it was kind of a rocky road. But Galef uses this to exemplify what she's going to call the scout mindset. And to understand what the scout mindset is, first we have to understand its opposite. That is the much more intuitive type of mindset that we use much more often, for better or worse, and that is the soldier mindset. If you think about the words that we use when we describe an argument or even just sort of putting together a case, even if it's not the sort of argument in a formal debate where one person wins the debate and the other person loses, even if we're disagreeing with someone, most of the words we use are words that are borrowed from combat. And Galef points this out. She says it's as if we're soldiers defending our beliefs against threatening evidence. The metaphor of reasoning as a kind of combat is baked right into the English language, so much that it's difficult to speak about reasoning without using militaristic language. Our beliefs are deep-rooted, well-grounded, built on fact, backed by arguments, rest on solid foundations. We, poke holes in someone's logic or shoot down their ideas. We challenge a position. And the word position here, obviously is metaphorical when we're talking about an argument because you're not actually standing in a position. But a military or an army on a battlefield has a position, like a literal position, a place that they are occupying, and the other army is going to try to take them out of that place and acquire that territory. So if I defend a position or attack your position, I am using military metaphors. You might not think of it as a metaphor. If I say that, that guy's argument undermined the other argument, I'm not thinking, I'm comparing my argument to a military that is digging a tunnel underneath a castle wall so that their troops can come up on the inside of that castle, or so that they can, pack explosives under the wall and blow it up. I don't realize that I'm using a metaphor when I use the word undermine in talking about an argument, but it still has that effect. It shapes our whole position, our whole goal to be one of like attack and defeat rather than understand and get to know the truth better. And I'm going to use this quotation a lot. It's a big one. It's written in very academic jargon, but it's very insightful because it packs into, surprisingly, I know it doesn't look like a short quotation, but it packs a whole lot of understanding about how the mind works into a relatively short space. But we don't have to be fighting a military battle to have the same sort of feeling of wanting to be validated, wanting to have our presumptions, even if they're, a feeling. Well, we have a feeling that we know something even when we don't, and we are sometimes more interested in having that feeling affirmed rather than being accurate in what we know. So psychologists Richter and Kruglansky call this the need for closure. And everybody has a need for closure to some degree. And, that sort of feeling, that need can be higher or lower depending on the state we're in. But when we're in that state of having this need for closure, we then have a tendency to seek immediate and permanent answers. By immediate answer, think about, if there's something you just realize you don't know, like you see an actor in a TV show or in a movie, and you think, I just saw that actor recently. Where did I see that actor? Who was that actor's name? What did I see that actor playing? And just realizing there's something you don't know can cause us a little bit of anxiety. Sometimes you can just relieve that anxiety by taking your phone out and going to IMDb or Googling it. And, it's easy enough to satisfy, but we can find an answer relatively quickly. But sometimes, or even the fact that we feel this need to then look that up tells us that there was some sort of feeling we thought we needed to find this answer, even though it might not be relevant to the thing we're watching at the time. And if you're watching a movie in a theater, and that theater has a strict policy about not taking your cell phone out, then you're risking something, and of course you're missing the movie while you're looking up the name of that actor. The movie that you're there to watch is continuing to go, and you're missing it because you've just got this feeling that, I need to know where I saw this actor before. Most of the time we can find an answer very quickly, ask somebody, Google it. But once we have an answer, we don't typically say, well, is that the right answer? How do I know I can trust that answer, or even know what my source is? If I Google something and just whatever comes up at the top of the list is, usually not even, it might have a link with it, but sometimes it's taken out of context and I don't know where it came from. Or if I ask chat or, an AI, what is the answer to this question? It very often doesn't know where its own answer came from. So I might have an answer, but I don't know that it's an answer I can trust. I don't know that it's an answer I can actually, feel confident about. But by finding an answer, I have alleviated that need for closure. I now have that feeling of closure. It feels good to feel like I know something. But what I just did, they describe as seizing and freezing. In other words, I seize on the first available answer, but then I freeze on it. I don't want to keep thinking, is that the only possible answer? Are there other more accurate answers or more likely answers? I don't usually do that. I don't, look through the first, several Google results and say, well, do they all agree? And I certainly don't keep, investigating, saying, well, I'm not going to stop until I get like 3 potential answers or 5 potential answers. I usually just feel like 1 is enough, and I don't want to keep thinking of it beyond that, because what I was looking for wasn't the most accurate answer. I was looking for the feeling that I know something, that feeling of closure. So having that need for closure, we have a tendency to seek immediate answers, like available quickly, but then permanent answers. In other words, once I find that answer, I don't want to have to keep second guessing it. I don't want to have to keep qualifying it and making it more detailed. I just want it to be the only answer I need. And I want to be able to use it to form a judgment urgently, but also to attain what they are saying here is transsituationally stable rather than transitory answers. In other words, an answer or sort of general rule that I can use in lots of situations or every situation, not one that I can only use sometimes, not one that I have to really think about and qualify. So they call this premature seizing and freezing on the most accessible cues or information. And the types of sort of knowledge that we apply, what they're calling inference rules. These are rules that govern what sorts of inferences we can make when we see like new facts. Something I've never seen before, but I've got some general principle that I use to interpret it or decide what to do with that new fact. And I like those to be rules that I can use in all situations, or at least a lot of situations. So that need for closure leads to a tendency to encode situational information, that is new information, this new situation, to encode it in terms of momentarily accessible inference rules. That is the first general category that pops into my head, or the first, rule of thumb that I usually use in this sort of situation. And then reduce the tendency to search for alternative relevant constructs. In other words, I just need some rule to apply to this, some inference that I can use to figure out what's going on, and then stop thinking about it. And what they're calling inference rules here, we're going to use the word heuristic. A heuristic is you can think of it as a rule or a piece of information, but it's used as a method of problem solving or decision making, often derived through relatively unstructured methods such as trial and error, conventional wisdom. Heuristic may work to solve a problem most of the time, but it's not going to be 100% accurate all the time. A good example of this is the rule for figuring out if E or I comes first in a word. You probably learned this very early in your education. Use I before E except after C. And if you remember that word, you can spell words correctly that have E and I or I and E in it, except when you can't. You can think of lots of words that follow this rule, like yield and field and conceive and believe and receive and deceit and shield and sealing and receipt and thief. But there are some words that don't follow that rule. There, ate, foreign. So that's led some people to say, well, it's I before E except after C when it sounds like E. But remember what I said about seizing and freezing. We're seizing with an E first and an I second. So that rule will help you spell the word right a lot of the times, but not all the time. Now, that's a very specific, clear rule that you probably learned to articulate early on in your education. A lot of the heuristics we use, we don't stop to think about. They're not rules that we learn to make explicit. We talked about the bat and the ball problem in a previous video, where the cognitive reflection test is this test to see if there's an intuitive answer that pops into your head. Do you question it? Do you try to verify it first, or do you just go ahead and say it out loud? Well, if the bat and the ball cost $1.10 in total, the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? There's this little heuristic in your brain that just subtracts $1 from $1.10 and comes up with the answer of 10 cents. But that answer is not right. That would make the total, if the ball was 10 cents and the bat was $1 more, that means the bat would be $1.10 by itself. Add that to the 10 cents of the ball and there would be $1.20 in total. But the heuristic, most of us use so quickly that we don't even think of ourselves as, having a heuristic. It just happens so fast that the first thing that comes to our consciousness is the output of that heuristic. That is the answer 10 cents. But the answer, of course, is wrong. But that means that your brain has a lot of heuristics in it that you're not even aware of that still structure your thinking. So back to that need for closure description. We tend to want our rules for coming to a decision to apply as much as possible. So we like them to be as abstract as possible. Like if I didn't have to have if I just had the I before E rule and I didn't have to add the qualification of except after C or when it sounds like E, only for those to then not be enough. If the rule for all English words was I before E, period, all the time, that would be a lot easier to use. And those are the kinds of rules we want to be accurate. But that is more of a want, and it just doesn't deal with the complexities of reality. So we have a preference for abstract knowledge that affords permanence or consistency across situations. In other words, I just want to use the same rule all the time, all situations, not have to think in each situation, which rule do I use? And so in the case of the I before E rule, we tend to have this feeling that these other words somehow broke the rule. They didn't break the rule. Those words existed before the rule did. But we have this feeling like there's something wrong with the word because the word doesn't fit this general rule. We don't stop to realize that it's the general rule that's a little premature. And that also applies when we can't find what they're calling consensual knowledge exhibiting stability or consistency across persons. In other words, when other people disagree with us, they don't consent to the same answer or use the same heuristic we do. And this is why the metaphor of soldier mindset is very appropriate, because a lot of times when our beliefs are confronted with counter evidence, rather than deal with the counter evidence, we just naturally get mad at the person who brings up the counter evidence. We blame the messenger. And we see this happen in the Dreyfus Affair. Galef points out that when there was one handwriting expert said, yes, Dreyfus's handwriting matches the spy letter, that is exactly what the prosecutors wanted to hear. But when the second handwriting expert said he didn't see a match there, they didn't want to hear that. They didn't say, oh, that's interesting, maybe we've got the wrong guy. No, instead they said, let's get rid of that guy's testimony. How do we get rid of that? Well, let's think. That handwriting expert works for the Bank of France. The world of finance was full of powerful Jewish men. Again, this very old sort of conspiracy theory that, the Jews control the banks, and this guy works for the bank, and Dreyfus was Jewish, so we can't trust him. There's a conflict of interest. Never mind the fact that, of course, a handwriting expert works for the bank. That's the primary reason that profession exists. At that time, they needed somebody who could verify that the person who signed this check or the person that signed this contract was actually this person. But that didn't seem to matter. The fact that he didn't give them the prosecution the evidence they wanted meant that they didn't want to deal with that information. So to avoid dealing with the information, they just had to come up with a reason to get rid of that guy. Well, it gets even worse for Picard. Remember, if he's going to decide to look for the actual spy rather than just confirm the conviction of Dreyfus, he is putting himself in risk. He wanted to find the truth, and he pressed on with his investigation, but he met with resistance from the army, and that grew into outright enmity. His superiors sent him off on dangerous missions in hopes that he would never come back. In other words, suicide missions. That's how bad they want to get rid of him. When that didn't work, they had him arrested on charges of leaking sensitive information, primarily because he was, trying to let people know that Dreyfus wasn't the real spy, and that in the interest of national security, that they needed to find the real spy, even though his superior officers didn't want to continue that. So they, rather than dealing with his questions or the new evidence that was emerging, they just wanted to get rid of that guy. Both of these are a version of what's called disconfirmation bias. Now, I've talked about confirmation bias as a way to sort of just confirm your belief, and it might seem like disconfirmation bias is the opposite, but it's actually not. Disconfirmation bias is when we have this motivation to disconfirm what other people say when they disagree with us. We want to get rid of the other person. If we just sort of attack the person, that's technically the ad hominem fallacy, which we'll probably discuss later in the semester. But it's one example of disconfirmation bias, which is I just don't want to accept information that challenges my foregone conclusion. And confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias can work together. They're not at odds because we don't apply them to the same people. We apply confirmation bias naturally to our own belief. We just look to confirm that, and we look to disconfirm beliefs that are in conflict. Now, to do the opposite of this, if we try to disconfirm our own position, that might actually be a good tendency, but it's not one that's very natural. As they're used this way, they both are forms of motivated reasoning. That is, anytime we begin with a conclusion and we just try to persuade other people to accept it, or just try to, prove it true without actually investigating its accuracy, we can still use disconfirmation to deflect any counter evidence. And Galef quotes psychologist Tom Gilovich, who describes motivated reasoning, both the confirmation and disconfirmation versions, this way. When we want something to be true, we ask ourselves, can I believe this? Can I come up with any excuse to believe this, even if it seems kind of ridiculous? Like when Dreyfus was overheard, saying positive things about the German military. Well, obviously he could be saying that because he wanted the French military to be prepared for an enemy he thought they were underestimating. But I would rather, if I want to convict Dreyfus, then I just want that to be evidence that he's guilty. Or when the handwriting analyst the first handwriting analyst realizes or declares that Dreyfus's handwriting matches the spy letter, then the prosecutors want that to be true, so they use confirmation bias. They don't second guess who this handwriting analyst is. But when the other handwriting analyst says they don't match, they want to get rid of him. So when we don't want something to be true, we instead ask ourselves, must I believe this? And we're searching for an excuse to reject this other information. So that's disconfirmation bias. But they're both forms of motivated reasoning. Now, I will say that Galef doesn't use the word motivated reasoning by itself. She uses directionally motivated reasoning and accuracy motivated reasoning. But most of the time, we're just going to use the word motivated reasoning to be, you're motivated to justify a foregone conclusion. Now, again, the Dreyfus Affair is something that happened more than 100 years ago, but it's not like it was the first time. This is, part of, our human psychology, and it's been around as long as recorded history. That's just why Galef cites the Greek historian Thucydides, who actually went around right before the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, and he talked to people in Athens and talked to people in Sparta, and he realized that they both overestimate their capability to defeat the other. Athens thought they could make short work of the Spartan military. The Spartans thought they could make short work of the Athenian military. And both were wrong. It ended up being this long, protracted war and went really, really bad for Athens. But Thucydides makes this comment when he's talking to these guys who he can just tell are just wrong about their own capabilities. He says, their judgment was based more upon blind wishing than upon any sound prediction. For it is a habit of mankind to use sovereign reason to thrust aside what they do not desire. In other words, we're capable of reasoning. We know, Homo sapiens, we're the wise men, the wise humans. But we don't typically use that reasoning to find the truth. We usually just use it to justify our foregone conclusions, our prejudices, our opinions, our hopes, the things we want to be true. And so we can use that reason to be more accurate, but we typically just don't. We want to protect that feeling of closure, that confidence in ourselves just feels good. Getting to the actual accurate truth sometimes requires a lot of humility, a lot of modesty, and a lot of realizing, wow, I was really wrong about that. But what should be apparent both in the Dreyfus Affair and in the Thucydides example is that these are militaries that, their survival depends on accurate intelligence, and even then they tend to do the same thing that most of us do most of the time, even when the stakes are very low. That is, they just want to justify arguments that lead to a conclusion they want to be true rather than finding the one that is true. And again, that's built into our language. This is not a new thing. And because it's built, attacking a position and that sort of thing, that's this sort of governing metaphor that we use in arguments. And so that's why Galef uses the phrase soldier mindset. That part was pretty easy to, a pretty easy metaphor there. But I love her alternative, figuring out like an alternative metaphor to the soldier mindset was actually very clever on her part. It helps us to understand the soldier mindset by its opposite, which is what she calls the scout mindset. And the scout mindset is that attempt to figure out if you're wrong. That is the opposite of the need for closure. That is the sort of need for accuracy. I've got this feeling of closure. I feel good about the answer I've come to, but I really, really want to know if it's right or not. And so, because motivated reasoning, and again, she uses the phrase directionally motivated reasoning, but I'm just going to use the word motivated reasoning to mean that sort of soldier mindset, confirmation bias. But if motivated reasoning is like being a soldier fighting off threatening evidence, accuracy motivated reasoning, what we're going to call critical reasoning, is like being a scout forming a map of a strategic landscape. If your map is wrong, you might have sort of drawn a map that probably took a lot of work, a lot of calculation, a lot of exploration. But if there's something that's wrong on it, you want to know that. You don't want to just dismiss the inaccuracy of your map because you're not going to know where you are. So if we put ourselves in that mindset, we're not losing something whenever we're proven wrong. We're actually gaining something. So if you're in soldier mindset and someone proves you wrong, or you just confront counter evidence, that is a threat that you want to fend off. But if you're a scout and somebody says that, your river actually runs on the other side of this mountain range, or on the other side of those mountains is this fertile area that, you can, build a farm on, or something like that, you want to know that there was something missing from your map. We understand that the map is not the territory. It is a representation. It's an abstraction. It's oversimplified. And if we want it to be more complicated, then we want to be told when there's something missing. That is, not something we see as a threat. It's actually a benefit. So if we're in soldier mindset and there's this belief we want to defend, that we want to be true, like, obviously probably not one you're too stressed about, but if we go back to that heuristic, I before E except after C, if I'm in soldier mindset and I want to say, yes, that is a rule and every word has to follow it, I can come up with lots of instances of words that follow the rule. I can use confirmation bias to say, look at yield and field and conceive and shield and deceit and thief. I've got evidence that if we just stop looking there, that would confirm that belief. But if I'm actually asking the question, do you always use I before E except after C? I know in these words on the left you do, but I'm wondering if there's some others out there. Then I can, look until I find words like ate and seize and foreign and weird that would falsify that rule. So notice how just the metaphors we use when it comes to looking for data, interpreting that data, deciding what heuristics, what inferences to make about that data, the metaphors we're using are going to change not only like how we interact with it, but the very feelings we have. That soldier mindset is going to probably ignite our need for closure. And so we're going to be motivated to defend a foregone conclusion without asking, is that conclusion as accurate as possible? But if we're in scout mindset, we're using critical reasoning. We're always open to saying, like my main goal is to be as accurate as possible. It's not just to finish this map as quickly as possible and then, take off into this wilderness that I think I know when I really don't. And the readings we've done already in this class, just looking at the evolution of the word essay when it was first used by Michel de Montaigne to describe writing. Before that, it was always testing. It was always this sort of scout mindset type process. And that's what Montaigne wanted to incorporate. He was writing not to prove something or to refute somebody else, but to try to understand himself. And then Shane Parrish on the Farm Street blog talks about writing to this day, even when we've got AI that can generate, text for us, if we actually want to understand the thing, we have to go through that process. If we actually want to go through the critical reasoning process, we can't outsource that to an AI. We actually have to do that ourselves because we don't really know what sort of process AI or even other people are going through. That's something, if it's important to us, we have to do it ourselves.